Okay, it's 4:30, and I'm going to call the City of Kerrville Planning and Zoning Commission to order. Dorothy, would you call roll, please? Oh, Dorothy's not here. Sabine, would you call roll, please?
Bob Waller, Garrett Harmon,
Here.
Don Barnett,
Here.
Michael Siegerman,
Here.
Rustin Zuber,
Here.
David Jones, Marty Leonard. Thank you.
Thank you. First item on the agenda is Visitor Citizens Forum. Any person with business not scheduled on the agenda is encouraged to briefly speak to the Commission. Please fill out a speaker request form and give it to the Commission's secretary prior to the meeting. The number of speakers will be limited to the first 10 speakers, and each speaker is limited to 3 minutes. No formal action can be taken on these items, as the Open Meetings Act requires formal action items to be posted on an agenda no later than 72 hours before the meeting. If formal action is required, the items will be placed on an agenda for a future meeting. Item number 2 is a consent agenda. All items listed below on the consent agenda are considered routine or ministerial in nature and will be enacted with one motion. There will be no separate discussion of items unless a commissioner or citizen so requests, in which case the items will be removed from the consent agenda and considered separately. Item 2A is approval of the minutes from February 1st meeting.
I have a correction. Commissioner Zuber was here that day.
Yeah, I was going to make that comment. I got left off.
Thank you.
You noticed that you weren't on the paperwork?
Yes, I did.
Either way.
All right. Any other notes? Do I hear a motion?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes with the correction. I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second to approve the minutes with the correction of adding Commissioner Zuber. All in favor, raise your right hand. Passes 4-0. Okay, item 3A is just a discussion item on an ordinance with right-of-way design standards for wireless telecommunication networks. Mr. Paxton, want to fill us in on this?
Certainly will try. No, the Commission's had several conversations with Sabina in the past about where this started, where this came from. The state legislature this summer passed a bill now into law that certain types of cell towers are allowed in the public right-of-way. We're actually required to allow them if they meet the certain standards, height, size limitations, technology requirements. So what several cities have done across the state through Chapter 284 of the Local Government Code have implemented, updated their right-of-way management ordinance and implemented a design manual specific to the network nodes or the small cell towers. We've got several names. What we're looking at is, I think you've seen some pictures of several different varieties, up to 50 feet tall, possibly multi-carrier. Most of these that have been installed have been single carriers, much smaller antenna arrays than what we've seen in the past on the macro towers, the 100 to 150 foot towers that have multiple carriers, that big triangular array around them. These are much smaller. Some of them are just about a 3 foot tall cylinder. Looks like just a piece of pipe. Some of them actually have 2 or 3 small arrays mounted to the pole. Along with that comes some radio equipment, some of their fiber switch equipment, electric meters, some electric shutoff boxes. And so you can imagine that, along with everything else on a utility pole, can start to get pretty cluttered. Some companies take all of their auxiliary equipment and put it in one big cabinet. Looks like about a 2-drawer filing cabinet attached to the side of a telephone pole.
On the ground.
Some of them do it on the ground. Some of them mount them about halfway up the pole. Some cities, they've had requests for backup generators built into these. Some of them have had put in battery packs as a backup power source. And then the smaller ones, called micro nodes, are actually strung up with the line itself between pole to pole. Similar to some of the telecommunications and cable companies, they've got some repeaters and stuff built into their lines. And they're up to 18 inches long, 5-6 inches around, attached to the wire itself. So the design manual is geared at kind of giving them some requirements of how they can install, since they are in the public right-of-way. Up until this point, when it comes to utilities, the public right-of-way really has been looked at as a conduit to get utilities from the provider down the street to the end user. If you think of your water, sewer, electric cable, come from their primary source down the right-of-way onto private property into a private line, and that's their service that they're providing. When it comes to the network nodes, the public right-of-way is now being used as the actual delivery system of those services to their customers, more or less how we use private property today. So it's kind of a change in mindset on what public right-of-way can be used for. There is no line from that conduit to the user. They're just, some of these are actually standalone towers that just work off radio waves to communicate with one another. Some of them do have more or less kind of a backhaul line connecting their micro tower networks between the two. You've got your design manual in front of you. This is still a draft. City Attorney and I, in my case, attended a conference last week with Texas Municipal League to get some other cities' recommendations on how they've approached it. One of the things that we do not have is a very strong right-of-way ordinance, whether that's permitting curb cut and the design requirements for that into the utility installations, whether it's a franchise utility or these network node wireless communication facilities. Several cities have actually rolled the design manual into their right-of-way management ordinance. Other cities have adopted them separately. We're still kind of exploring what's going to be best for Kerrville as far as
Is there
how
one
it gets
advantage
adopted.
over, at this point, some advantage to one to the other, or not?
Maybe clarity for those that are looking for it. Outside of that, they're both adopted by council. Both are pretty stringent on what we can require as a city. It's just spelling out those guidelines so they're readily available to the different companies.
Sabina, you may have answered this already before, but is there a difference between state highway right-of-way within the city limits and not state highway right-of-way?
Well, the ordinance that I believe we're looking at, correct me if I'm wrong, because the state is basically has created these the limitations for what cities can do within the city rights of way. I don't believe that they're holding themselves to that standard, but so it's basically we're just looking at the city right of way and not having these restrictions also imposed on the state right of ways.
Kind of. It's TxDOT is held to the same local government code that we're going to be held to. We don't get to it. We, the city of Kerrville, don't get to approve these in the state right of way, but the governing state law would be the same thing. So TxDOT, whether it's district-wide or statewide, can adopt their own standards of how these will be
So they could look different
incorporated.
than,
They could.
are these like easements they're gonna be granted, essentially? I mean,
Not quite.
they have to apply for this?
They would have to apply for
Okay.
a permit, and that's one of the things that we're still working on as part of the right-of-way ordinance is a permitting process. Whether it's application, what are the nitty-gritty, what are their insurance requirements, what are their, if they're blocking lanes of traffic, how do we go through those safety precautions as part of their permit application?
At this meeting you went to, was there any discussion about future technology circumventing this? Does anyone know anything about that?
The micro nodes, the ones that are strung on the wire between poles, is about as far as anyone's seen so far. As of right now, this is the future technology, going from the large towers to
Small, everything's going smaller.
smaller, and of course, with a smaller tower, you're going to have more antennas. Whereas the previous towers, if you go back to the 3G network, some of those towers were 2-3 miles apart, and you'd still have reasonable coverage. As capacity's gone, or users have gone up, capacity of the towers has been taken up. They've started putting more and more towers closer together. Not that the antenna that they were using on the 4G wouldn't reach as far, they just couldn't capture as many users. That's why we have bad service in some areas, because there's too many people on it. With these, they're going to have a lower, from my understanding, they have lower intensity of the waves that they're sending out, but they'll be closer together to pick up that capacity. And of course, here some of the hillside and that kind of thing block some of those signals. So they're looking to provide more of a blanket coverage through more antennas, and to do so, they've made them smaller. And through the state legislature, that coverage is more accessible by requiring cities to allow them in their right-of-way.
Is there a possibility that telecommunication companies could contract with private owners and put these on their buildings?
Yes, there is. To my knowledge, some have. The issue becomes now they're working with a private property owner who wants rent. The state also came down and mandated a maximum fee that the city can charge for use of the right-of-way.
Rent control?
Basically.
Well, I mean, I know in a lot of, when I was working in Florida, in a lot of industrial areas, you could lease these guys a 10-foot by 10-foot piece of property, and they would construct a 120-foot tower.
Right.
And put 100 dishes on it.
I got to thinking that there may be some conditions where a building wall might be right on a right-of-way line.
Or in a design district or a historical district.
Right. I mean, to that point, I've seen the old macro tower or macro antennas mounted on buildings before. You'll have, obviously, four-sided building. You'll have one little antenna array on the north side, one on the far south side. Instead of putting a tower up, the building was already there, and that works well.
So
to kind of co-locate those.
Who's
This technology, they can co-locate that, but again, they're back to a private property owner.
Is there guidelines for private,
No.
Otherwise, a
This is just
private
right away.
property owner could give them the authority to put anything they wanted from, any cell tower, any node, whatever, 100 nodes or and there's nothing anyone can.
That would come back to just your usual land use zoning. So if we're co-locating on an existing structure, it would just follow the Kerrville zoning code. If they're building a structure specifically for them, would still be treated like other cell phone towers at that point. The network nodes are specifically listed in the right-of-way with a maximum rent, if you will, of the right-of-way, that fee for the right-of-way use of $250 per pole, per node.
But to Mike's question, if it's going to be on a building, you still have to get that permitted probably.
Yes, excuse me. Sorry, I
But
misunderstood your question.
Just
It would still have to be permitted, it just wouldn't fall under these guidelines.
But it still have to come to the city to get permitted to put it on the building.
My
Yes.
question is, if Francisco's building downtown Kerrville,
Mhm.
that's private property. If one of these, communication entities came to him and wanted to put whatever they wanted to put up there as far as communication nodes or towers or whatever, I'm not sure that zoning covers that.
Controls it.
Well, it's not zoning, right, we still have the cell tower and antenna ordinance it was adopted separately, it's not under the zoning ordinance. So my understanding is we're not touching that one.
Correct.
And that one does allow existing structures to basically become the tower and just have the antenna there's a maximum height above that structure that it can extend.
Okay, that's what I was curious to know if there's guidelines that, you know, even though it's on private property, or do they have certain restrictions that they have to adhere to, or?
And that's still to the left to local control. Chapter 284 this summer,
This is just in the right of way.
just in the right of way,
Yeah.
and allows
Outside the
local
right of way.
control, but very limited. And so I know Sabina went over the design manual with you guys 2 weeks ago. I apologize, I was out with the flu. You did not want me here anyway. This is based off of a template through Texas Municipal League. After the Chapter 284 went into law, to the benefit of cities across the state, TML went through and kind of created a base template that follows that state law. I've looked through at least a dozen cities that have adopted design manuals, and 90% of them are using the same document or something
Very similar.
very similar. But because that state law is so restrictive and so concise, if you followed state law, you're going to end up with something very similar to this anyway. Looked through Amarillo, Bernie, Fredericksburg, Irving, Leon Valley, Lubbock, Shenandoah, Austin, and just kind of a quick review of Seguin, Temple, Abilene, Waco, and San Angelo. And they're all fairly consistent with this approach. The city of Irving is one that specifically tied theirs into their right-of-way ordinance. Like I said, other cities have adopted it separately because they already had a right-of-way ordinance, a right-of-way permit process established, and this was just kind of a sub-chapter of that. Like I said, we're still trying to figure out best practice for us, whether it's going to be one document or two referencing documents. At the end of the day, they're still going to look very similar. To what you have.
Content, it's just where you put them.
Correct. Also started conversations with engineers at KPUB. This state law this summer did allow municipally owned utility companies to basically go into individual agreements outside of this document, outside of the design manual. Again, kind of gives a third. TxDOT has their own process. KPUB can have their own process. And anything left in the right-of-way, the city of Kerrville can have our process. The engineers are reviewing this design manual at KPUB right now to see if they want to play along with us or not. I mean, their goal is so that we have that consistency. But they can actually contract one node at a time on each pole location if they choose to, or have one contract for the company and just locate wherever they see fit. So, trying to get as broad of an approach as we can for consistency's sake. But
Mike, any questions you have about this document? Thoughts?
Yeah, a lot of thoughts. Y'all have good questions. Those are really good questions. I'll just say a couple things. One, it is subject to litigation. There's, I can't remember, 17 or 27, something like that.
No, 36.
36, I was thinking 37. So there's 37 cities led by the city of McAllen that's suing the state because their claim is essentially that the state has allowed these private companies to go in and use public property for very little money, certainly nothing to fully compensate the cities for the use of their property. So getting to the question of whether these will be put on private property, they might be, but the best rate you're going to get is from the city, because we're limited to, in essence, $250 a year to allow them to go in. And
This is what's mandated by the state?
yeah.
And the cities that are suing, are they large cities?
Well, it's McAllen. McAllen's a fairly large city. So there's a host of them, 35 other cities that are involved. Bernie is, I think, the closest one that I recall. And then the city of Austin is also suing. I think in federal court. So,
It's
you
not
know,
over.
well, no, it's not. And so some cities are trying to ignore it. We were trying to do that as well. But then we have some users that are kind of asking us, hey, when are you going to open up your property to us? And we actually have arguably an application before us where they want to go in, and we just need to get our rules and ducks in a row so that we can comply with the law and let them in.
So there's no mechanism for the city to, based on what a private entity gets for allowing, we have no recourse to say, well, if it's on Joe Jones's building there, they're gonna pay him $500 a month. If it's on our, we're gonna get $250 a year. There's no.
No
there's-
leeway.
Prior to legislation this summer, there were some cities, I think San Antonio was actually one of them, had already contracted more or less like a franchise fee for $1,000 to $1,500 per node for each pole.
Per year.
So it kind of set a precedence at $1,000 to $1,500.
There's a price point that then it got broken
Yeah.
by legislators.
And then legislature came in and said,
Too high.
too high, bring it down to $250.
Um,
That's the premise of McAllen's lawsuit is they're giving away public land at that point.
Mm-hmm. I can see that.
When they had a price point set by industry standards and then negated that even lower. So you've removed the city's not just ability but requirement to protect the public land by just giving it away at a very low cost.
Yeah.
So, this was just put on the agenda as a discussion item. I'll admit I haven't had a chance to read the entire draft yet. Are there particular areas that we need to address either today or at the next meeting? What do we do?
The only pieces that we
Forward.
don't have established, I'm working with the city engineer. I know we have some, it wouldn't necessarily come before the planning commission. I know we have a few areas where we've kind of required underground utilities. It's not something that we've done citywide. I need to get with city engineer and define those. If there was a direction from you or the council to require all utilities underground, obviously that's a big undertaking for all future construction. But that's one area of discussion. For our design districts, most communities have actually seemed to be using the same picture as an example of a decorative pole.
Mm-hmm.
The premise being that it's all adjacent equipment is either underground or screened as ground equipment behind the right-of-way. All wires up and down the pole are enclosed in the pole, and so you end up with a very clean street light, essentially, with that
Little
cylinder on top, all the same color. So you have, I mean, most of them have shown kind of a dark brown or a black pole. Typical light standard with this extension up top. No exposed wires, no equipment strapped and screwed to the side of it. We just need to pick one. Like I said, of the dozen that I've looked at least half of those have the exact same picture in their design manual.
The clean look was
Yeah, very clean
important.
look.
I think it's very
So
important.
under design districts and historical districts that the city can designate, could it happen that you would designate a design district or historic district that has a state right-of-way going through it, like 16 or 27?
All three of our design districts that we
Okay,
currently
so
have.
Once we have, so we are saying you can't do this in a design district or historic district, even though there's a right-of-way, a state right-of-way, we can still exclude them from going in those areas? Mike?
See you in court.
I don't have a good answer for you on that one.
Like right under.
I think, yeah.
Okay.
We still can.
That's part of the law.
Okay.
That's what I'll,
Yeah, you can
I mean,
step.
if I'll, we're still kind of working through this. Drew's right, part of the right-of-way use ordinance, which we really don't have. I mean, we permit driveways that kind of encroach on right-of-ways. Really, we don't have anything else, not a tool, not regulations that apply to right-of-way. So, as we work through this, there'll be some issues that come up. But I'm fairly certain that we can control that. The state did give us, control over quote-unquote historic and high design areas.
We just can't restrict it outright. We have control over how many and what they look like.
No, I think it says you can.
To some extent, I mean, we can set standards for spacing and what they look like.
Okay.
We can set higher standards for the design in historic districts. Mike, I'll use downtown as the example. Downtown, we do have the decorative light poles around central business area. If they were to approach and try to put one on Highway 16, would the state permit that, or would we still have the authority to permit that and require the decorative
It's
pole?
in the design.
No, well, the classic thing is, what we heard is that the state's balking, because they're telling these companies that you're not paying us enough money. So
TxDOT is.
TxDOT's telling them that, which is just classic. So, but no, and again, that's another issue. I wrote down that issue. That's a good point. I don't know how it works. We don't control TxDOT right of way, although at times they really tell cities, "Hey, you all hold this property as a kind of as a trustee for the state." So at times the state really wants it both ways, where they own the property for certain aspects, and then they tell the city, "Oh, by the way, you got to go clean up the trash along our right of way, or in our right of way even." So we just have to work through that. But I don't think we will permit them. From what I heard, is that TxDOT's begrudgingly developing its own permit process as they go through this. But I'll say this too. I think, and we've experienced that cities are a little bit more responsive, arguably a little bit easier to work with, and so these providers are coming to the city and going just off. They might want to be in pretty close to a high traffic area like a highway, state highway, but they'll find a city right of way pretty close to it that's comparable, and that's what they'll pinpoint. So.
One of the applications that we have received, incomplete application, but was 100 feet off of Junction Highway. So they're not in TxDOT right of way anymore. They are on the city, obviously covering the same area.
100 feet off of Junction Highway.
Well, that's not in the right of way.
That's not in the right of way.
Oh, it was on a side street. It was on.
Yeah, so it's in our right of way.
Oh,
it's one of them, right?
It's in one of
Right.
the city
100 feet
streets,
off
or-
that,
So
kind of that
They're in
intersection.
the
It
city.
was on Hayes Street,
Okay.
100 feet off of Junction Highway, so that it's
So it's in the
obviously
city,
still
so it
serving
becomes a city's.
the traffic on Junction Highway,
Oh, sure.
but it's in the city right of way.
They don't have to mess with TxDOT then.
Exactly.
And we're still limited to $250 a year.
At this point, until
Yeah.
the
Right.
lawsuit's settled or whatever happens.
Now, if we
They
don't
rewrite-
adopt this,
or
we
they
don't even
rewrite
have
the
a fee
legislature.
structure for it.
Right.
Is that per node?
Per
250?
node.
Per node, yes, sir.
Yeah, so
So
however many.
that could add up if they had a lot of nodes, I guess.
Mhm.
Well, it's, the market was kind of dictating this, and as Drew alluded to, you had cities that were charging like $1,500. I think Houston was up to $2,500 a year for some of this. Our stance was that the Houstons and the San Antonios and the Dallases of the world had already opened up their right-of-way, and so arguably they couldn't then deny it to these folks. Well, we had never really done that, and so our initial stance was, well, wait, we haven't opened up our right-of-way. We don't know if we want to do it for y'all. Is there another way we can, kind of accommodate you? Can we put it, on City Hall or library or water tower? And then lo and behold, this legislation was percolating along and really actually gained some speed and was adopted. And so now we're stuck in some ways and having to work through it through that chapter of the local government code. But we'll get there, and it's I think from the city's perspective,
So if
staff's
we sign
perspective,
an
it's a
agree-
good technology.
We sign an agreement with a provider
Yeah, we won't sign an agreement. It'll be a kind of a permit process.
So, okay, so they'll get a permit, and they'll be paying $250. If the legislature changed the law, you
Yeah.
can go to market rate.
Right,
You can go to market rate.
right.
Yeah,
So you're not dead in the water completely.
No, one of our goals on this was when we established that fee structure, we're gonna reference the state law, not put it in our ordinance that it's $250, and then the state changes it, and we gotta come back and
Yeah.
Go
That's the
through
way-
this process.
That makes sense.
use it as a reference point. We're gonna charge essentially the maximum allowable at this time.
Sure.
And then if this court case goes through and says, all right, we're going back to a market rate, whether it's statewide or city by city, then we'll go through and adjust that fee structure.
Okay. That sounds better.
What an interesting concept.
So what do we as a commission need to do next regarding this document?
We can keep bringing it forward as we kind of finalize the hows and the wheres this is going to be drafted. But essentially, this is the language that's going to be in it. There's not a lot left to tweak on it just because it is so concise on the state law side. Council did
Is the
ask.
cosmetic piece of this in here?
Say again?
The cosmetic side we're talking about where it's very contained, and
Right.
clean and all that?
It is in here, but I don't have the example in here.
Okay.
I've
But the language is in there about
the
it.
language is in there, correct? I just
Mike, are you comfortable with all the language in the document? As comfortable as you could possibly be, I
I
mean,
think I heard one of y'all say, I haven't looked at it all the way
Okay.
through. I mean, I've scanned it. I think Drew's pulled it off TML's site, so it's been vetted from city's perspective. But I haven't, dotted I's and crossed T's and things like that. I've just been kind of behind the curve because we've been trying to figure out the court cases, and the cities have actually already survived one round. The companies have filed a motion to dismiss, and the state has kind of played some games with it too, saying, well, you can't sue the state because that's not a named person, and then they switched it to add the attorney general who would arguably enforce it. And he said, well, basically, I had nothing to do with it, so it's been kind of hide the ball. But my point is that the cities have won round one, and we're with a host of cities who felt pretty confident in their claim and that their their probability of success. So, all that being said, is I haven't read the document, but that's that's going to be their expertise.
Sounds like they're after the fee issue.
let's say
They are,
the
they
essence-
are.
The essence is not the fact that
Yeah.
you're gonna be forced to let them.
No. It's
The
No.
essence is what you're gonna be able to charge them.
Right, because again, cities are like, we want the good technology. I mean, you all citizens,
absolutely.
customers want the good technology. I heard, I live just outside the city limits, close to Mr. Zuber here, and we'll never. I've heard this lately that we don't have really good Wi-Fi or internet service, and this is what I've been told lately. Oh, you'll never get a line. It's all going to be towers and nodes, and so I want the nodes.
Yeah,
I want a
cell
node. I
service.
want a node right down the block for me.
Yeah.
But from the city's perspective, they ought to pay fair market, and
Yeah.
not
it's
sure
about
they're
the-
doing that.
it's always about the money.
So really what we need is you're comfortable with the document, Mike's comfortable with the document, we need a document, I guess, that you guys are comfortable with, and then whatever we need to do to approve it or whatever, that's all we can do, I would assume that.
I guess in the meantime, us as commissioners could read through it, highlight any questions that we have,
Sure.
Yeah, I
Bring
read
those-
through it and
bring those to the next meeting. Is that something that needs to be as a distinct agenda item? Is it something that we could just pose as questions at the end of the meeting?
Well, I think it's one. I think it is good that you are looking at it because it's going to be. I mean, certainly it's a use, and there's some aesthetics to it, and you all should weigh in on that. So, perhaps, look at that as opposed to kind of any sort of procedure or process involved. And so, what I would suggest is whether that takes you another 2 weeks or a month, do that. We're kind of behind the curve, and so we're really trying to get staff to look at right-of-way, the proposed right-of-way ordinance. Then we need to get that to the users of the right-of-way, like Atmos and Hill Country Telephone, to make sure they don't have any questions. But we're really trying to push that out. So it might be 2 weeks, it might be another month, it probably will actually even be longer than that. But you all have a definite role, and it's kind of like, I don't know if you all have ever approved kind of the public improvement standards specs that are part of, making sure streets are put in correctly and curb and gutter and things of that nature. But that's what this is kind of akin to.
Right.
Well, I read through it, and I mean, really not knowing exactly what they're doing, it's kind of hard to comment. I mean, it looks like it's a good design manual. It looks like it protects what we're trying to do, but not being an expert in nodes and towers and right-of-ways and stuff like that, I don't know. I mean, you guys read through it and see what you think, but I don't know how much comment we can really have. If you are comfortable with it and Mike becomes comfortable with it, I mean, I guess from an enforcement standpoint, we could look at it and see what we see as an issue.
I've learned a whole lot more about telecommunications than I ever cared to know.
I believe that.
I mean, like I said, there's not a lot of leeway of what we can draft. We can reword it, but it's going to say the same thing because the state law was so concise on allowances. I think one of the cities had almost the same document verbatim, except they took all of the state code references out. So everywhere where it says Chapter 284, they just struck that and left all the language around it, which, if you go back to 284, that was the definition in the state law. So it really ends up just kind of mirroring it one way or another. But those few specifics, like I said, the design districts you guys have already weighed in on. What are our design districts in town? We've established those. We've set a standard that they will have decorative poles, concealed and camouflaged to the most extent that we can. Now it's just going to get down to the fine details of right-of-way management as a whole, whether it's HT, CT, or if it's Atmos, Time Warner Cable, Suddenlink, whoever we're talking about. How much ground equipment can you have in one area? Do we want everybody bunched up in one corner? Do we want them all separated out?
What about the underground issue? Is that kind of addressed in here too?
It is. And again, that's going to be kind of a citywide standard. If we were to say from here forward, all utilities must be underground, I know it's going to have a drastic impact on development costs, construction costs. Transmission lines can't be underground, so you still have your big high lines above ground. I don't know that K-Pub's really prepared to throw all of their distribution lines underground. So that's not certainly a step I think the community's ready to take. But as far as running lines from node to node, if they're within the existing telephone pole lines, what's one more line going to be added to it versus trying to trench between the sewer line and the water line to add more underground utilities?
So you said you have an existing incomplete application from one of these users to install the nodes. So when they come in and they're looking for a permit, they're making an application to you looking for a permit. That doesn't have to come before P&Z. You just issue them a permit, correct?
Right.
It's based on this.
Yeah.
Well, right now it's just based on the state law. We have to issue something.
And from our standpoint,
There's no standards other than the state law.
Correct.
Yeah.
How would
this
these
establishes
standards- This is more standard.
a
These
little
are
more of a
little
level
more
of
tightened
standards?
down.
Correct.
how would this impact this commission? We're looking at trying to approve this manual. Once this manual is approved, if someone comes for a permit.
You'll never see it again. As a commission, it won't come back to you.
Okay,
No.
that was my question. So there's really no enforcement issues for us. It's just a matter of inputting on what this design manual should be.
Correct.
Yeah, I think it'd be a good idea for us to read it and get familiar with it as commissioners. But, there's still some work to be done. We don't need to edit
Okay.
edit it.
You have to read it more than once.
Hey, Drew, you mentioned underground utilities. That's something that came up at through the Kerrville 2050 group.
Mhm.
So, I mean, that's an interesting topic.
And with the way this document's drafted, we can put in, and I'm going to kind of make some things up for a moment, just bear with me. If we already established that downtown was an underground utility area, and we decide that everything around the VA hospital is underground utility area today, those can go in this document. We've got a caveat in here that if council adopts other underground districts, those just roll right into it, whether they're described here or not. So
You're
if
talking about current or future?
both,
Okay.
we can establish the current ones in this document, and then we've got a language in here that also adds future ones if we adopt any. So if out of Kerrville 2050, if one of our implementation projects is to look at underground areas, or the community decides that they are ready to take the bite to go to underground utilities citywide, that'll of course be adopted in
Into every-
addition to.
Yeah.
So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it was just a comment really, because I know that was discussed and it would relate to this somehow. So.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really, you all probably know this is really for staff, and I just feel like, if I don't tell them now, I'll forget it. So we had a project over here, remember on this corner, EIC paid to take out some utility poles, and K-Pub buried the
Okay.
lines. So we have a precedent for that. That was supposed to be kind of the starting point for kind of doing that in the downtown area.
Well, and actually, they did it all the way along Sidney Baker 10 years ago.
Oh, that's right, when they redid, yeah, that's a good point.
I mean,
When they
Yeah.
redid
so
Sidney
that,
Baker, yeah.
and I
Yeah.
remember seeing that in the old comprehensive plan.
Okay.
That was an item that came up in the old comprehensive plan, and it was addressed to a certain extent, and I think it was good. I mean, dealing with the traffic and the construction for 9 months on Sidney Baker was kind of a pain.
Yeah, but it's worth it.
But it's something that there was progress made, and some precedent set. And as long as you're not trying to take it all in one big bite, I think that we'll get there.
Well, you look at any residential development that is all underground, it's substantially better.
Right.
I mean, it's just way better than.
Nobody does above ground much.
Right.
Except maybe, are they doing above ground over here on 534? Do you know?
I don't know.
There's some development over there now, apartments, whatever they're doing. I don't know. It's a good question though. You need to go look.
All right. Anything that we need to do as commissioners moving forward on this?
Just got a pretty good consensus from you guys of kind of keep rolling forward and get to the details, and we'll bring it back.
Tighten it up.
Tighten it up and bring
Raise
it
the
back.
rate. Raise the rate.
All right. Next
Join-
item on the agenda.
Join the lawsuit, Mike.
Next item on agenda, number 4, staff reports. We have anything on for the next meeting?
Yes, we will. A few things queued up, but I think in the past, the previous planners would tell you what those cases would be. And I haven't been doing that. I just wanted to let you, we don't always know for sure. And I would think it would be such a great idea to start talking about them before they're actually on your agenda anyway. But we do have some items queued up.
Okay.
Surprise, surprise.
All right. Item 5 is adjournment. Do I hear a motion?
I'll make a motion.
Second.
Got a motion and a second to adjourn. All in favor? Passes 4-0. We adjourn at 5:14.
Thank you, gentlemen.